Harwich, Essex, 1938. A batch of Jewish refugees arrive at the sanctity of England from the brutality and persecution of the Nazi regime. Some would never return to their homeland due to being orphaned at the hands of the horror that was the Holocaust. Europe 2011 becomes a safe haven for millions of men, women and children fleeing from war-torn Syria. The Calais jungle houses one of the biggest refugee camps on the continent. Germany, contrary to the attitudes they had towards non-Germans 70 years ago, now house the largest number of refugees than any other European country. In this documentary, we speak to those who were there and to those who have stories to tell. This is Refugees, Years Apart.
Jim was a friend of, well, companion, life companion for my mother for 8 years, and he had become an integral part of our life. He was integrated into our family, and he was a very, very special person. He took on the role of advisor, mentor, step-grandfather to my sons, and was just an absolute gem of a person. He was what I call a solid character and old school standards, and he was just a great friend to me, to my sons, and a wonderful support for my mother.
Unfortunately, in 2016, Jim passed away, but Helen is trying to keep his memory and story alive.
My mother actually said to me, "You ought to hear Jim's story," and he suddenly started to tell little bits and snippets of what he'd gone through during his departure from Germany and his move to becoming a British citizen, which was an exceptionally long story. It was heartache, there was so much pain within the story, but also so much light and love at the end of it. But so packed full of incredible things that happened to him. We sat and talked about it over dinner, and we were all a bit mesmerised. And then we started to work together to put it all down in writing, because it's something that really should be remembered. I don't think anybody knows about the journey and about the transitions that you had to make. And moving from a completely, at the time initially when he was born, it was a benign country. There were no huge political dramas when he was born, but I suspect things were probably brewing. Jim's story began in a town called Guben, which is on the German-Polish border. He'd had a very, very loving upbringing. His father was a Russian, had been a Russian prisoner of war during the First World War. When the war ended, he preferred to stay in Germany. As for him being Jewish, it was, in his opinion, a kinder and better place for him to live. So he decided not to return to Mother Russia. He stayed in Germany and made his life as a craftsman. He was a tailor. He met Jim's mother, who was practicing Catholic, I believe. And they met, they married. She was Gertrude, and his father was Selik, but was actually known as Fritz. Very strange. And gradually, as things were happening to his family, and to his, at the time, obviously, when his brother was alive, his brother was feeling it as well. And they were really, I think, woken up by the brutality of the regime on the morning when 4 brown-shirted men and the policeman from the town arrived at the front door and just dragged Fritz off. Gunther died before Fritz was taken to the Oranienburg camp. Jim he remembered actually going for the policeman And they said, pull him back or he comes too. And I just remember, he was a 13-year-old boy, and I don't know why they left him, but they did. And of course, Gertrude just collapsed on the floor, and she'd lost one son, she'd now lost her husband, didn't really know what was going on. And then as quickly as he'd been taken, he comes back. She was terrified for her son, and she was part of a church. She'd become an evangelical Christian, and part of this church, the Christian community was really pulling together to try to protect the children from people of the Jewish faith, to protect their children and get them out of the country safely, because they could see what was happening. The camps people were being taken, they were being just dragged away from their families. And so I think, probably as any mother would, she had the heartbreaking decision of knowing that she'd got to get him out of the country to keep him alive, because he was classed as Jewish. And when he went home that night, this one particular night, his mother was reading a book by the fire. And he walked in, he was chatting, and she was staring down at the book, and she said, "How would you like to go and live in England?" And it was deeply moving when I spoke to Jim about this, and it's still something, as a parent, you look at how much she'd lost in her life, and I know with very many others, but when you put yourself in that position and you realise she'd lost everything. She lost absolutely everything in the moment that Jim said yes. And he'd said to his mother, "This is great, and we're going to be free finally." And she said, "No, you are. I can't come." Which just must have been torturous as a mother. It must have been absolutely torturous. So they went. They went with the group, the religious group that was headed up by a vicar. Liaised with her, got him ready, and he was one of the older ones. And in fact, Jim was one of the last. Was on one of the last Kindertransports before the outbreak of war. Well, when he was 16, Jim and his two friends decided they were going to try and sign up. And of course, being 16, they were just booted out the door. And they were just so desperate to get into the fight and to help protect freedom, really, freedom of thought, freedom of speech. So they had to go back to their jobs, and they ended up having to wait another 2 years before they could actually sign up. And when they did, they ended up signing. I'm laughing because Jim. They ended up working for the. They were assigned to the Pioneer Corps, because at that point they were still classed as German citizens. There was a mistrust of them, and so they were given the dirtiest jobs out there. So they would go and literally fill up the coal trains and the trucks and move coal, which was needed obviously around all over the country, and that's what they were doing. And then the war got really nasty, and Dunkirk happened, and the reality was that these people that were obviously showing their commitment to the country, they were, the door was opened. By very nature of the fact that I wrote a book about it, I felt compelled to write it, or should show the level of impact it had on me, and the need to record it, and aspects of his life, and what he went through, to try to share it. I think he was a very, very charming gentleman who was a big part of our family. He became more important as the months and years went by. And so for me, his presence was very special in our life and in our family, and he was a family member to us. And it's such a contrast to how his beginning when he was 14, how his life had been ruptured. We kind of feel it was such the other side of a coin to him, to have a nurturing, loving family around him. His own family live a long way from him, and he didn't see them very often. So we felt very privileged to have him in our life and to have him as part of our everyday. He was a wonderful man.
And my father died in Auschwitz, and my mother died in Terezin. And they died in 1942.
Wow.
Yeah. We lived in a flat, and I used to go to a school nearby, which I liked very much. And my mother owned a shop, and I used to like helping in the shop. And my grandparents, they had animal sanctuary, and I used to love going up there and looking at the animals. And I used to go once a week to my grandparents, who lived quite nearby. And, I had a very happy childhood. And on a Saturday, I used to go out with my father. And really, I don't remember much apart from that. And then when suddenly my mother said, we're going to Prague, and that was a journey that took 6 months, during which time I went to 3 different schools, and my last report was signed the day before I came to England. I had no idea with what organisation I was going. I just knew that I was being sent from the country. And we lived in Prague for a very short time in a flat. And this particular day, my parents took me to Wilson Street station, and the station was absolutely crowded with parents and children. Some were babies in arms, some were older children, and my father didn't want me to go at all. But some years later, he said to my mother, you did the right thing, to let her go. And you can imagine the scene with parents knowing they might not see their children again. Of course, the children didn't have that sort of idea of what was going on. And we got onto the train. The journey was uneventful as far as I remember, and we travelled through Germany to the Hook of Holland. And in the Hook of Holland, we went aboard a very large ship, and all I can remember is a very nice lady giving me a strawberry jam sandwich on white bread. And of course, continental people don't eat white bread, they mostly have rye bread. And I thought these sandwiches were lovely. Next thing I remember was this large hall, which I later found out was Liverpool Street Station. And the children were there with their names on pieces of cardboard around their neck, and they were collected one by one. And I was one of the last ones to go because my guardian lived on the Isle of Anglesey, and it was a long journey for her to make. And eventually she came, and we went by train back to Crewe, and then some sailors took me onto the local Holyhead train and sang Welsh lullabies to me, apparently. And we went to the Isle of Anglesey, and on Bangor Station, my Uncle Rob was there to take us to Heatherbank. There were no trains on Anglesey at night at that time. So we made the journey by car, and I can remember it was July the 1st, 1939, and it was a beautiful moonlight night, and we drove along this lane, opening gates and shutting gates because the cattle would have got through out otherwise. And I was beginning to feel very, very homesick. And we parked at the farm at the bottom and walked up these 2 fields, and I was beginning to feel very sad. And we opened the kitchen door, and on the kitchen table was a tabby cat. And the minute I saw Tiger, I knew everything would be all right, and so it was. I spoke German with my guardian, whom I was to call Mouse because some people thought she was very quiet. And her sister Enid and her one daughter at that time, Jane, were staying with us, and Tiger was their cat, and she used to come on holiday every year in her basket and stay there. And slowly I've started learning English, and we used to go to school in Llangefni, which was the market town of Anglesey, and she taught English at the local grammar school, and I went to the local church school. And within 2 months I had learned to speak English, and so we were able to converse in English and no longer in German. I could speak both Czech and German, but I completely forgot German, and slowly I also forgot how to speak Czech. I went to the local school, and I was very happy there, and I settled in very, very well. And I suppose because I was a child refugee, I was spoiled rotten by various people, and I had a very happy childhood. And when I was about 12 years of age, the war was coming to an end, and my guardian said, I think it would be a good idea if you went to a Czech boarding school to relearn your native tongue, which I did. When the school broke up, and the children whose parents were alive went back to Czechoslovakia, some stayed with the local relatives, and some stayed with the people that had taken them in, and made their life in England and were employed, and a lot of them gave a lot to the local country that had taken them in. I went into nursing, which I did for 45 years in different branches, and until I retired. I've been married for 50 plus years. My husband is a retired solicitor, and we have 2 daughters, Rachel and Emmy. Rachel married John, and they have 2 boys who live in the next road, so that's very nice. And Naomi, our younger daughter, lives about 2 miles up the road. I've been very fortunate. I worked all my life. I had a pension. We own our own house. We've got a family, and I'm very happy in this country.
December 2018. The 80th anniversary of the arrival of the first Kindertransport is held at a museum in Harwich, next to where the children first arrived all those years ago. As well as remembering the valiance of what people did during World War II, people from all over the country come to raise awareness about the modern refugee crisis, how we can help and how we can save so many innocent lives.
Today, European leaders called an emergency meeting to solve the worst refugee crisis since World War II.
And today we're taking a look at how the ongoing conflict has shaped what some call one of the world's worst refugee crises.
Now, look, we're facing the worst refugee crisis since the end of World War II.
Humanitarian crisis, the biggest wave of refugees in modern history.
Well, I think quite a lot of people are involved with present-day refugees, financially and physically helping as much as they can. But of course, we're now the oldest generation, and there's a limited amount that we can do. But certainly they need help. Some come because to get a better life, but some come so that they might live.
Because there was so much that I discovered about life back then, and I think it does reflect in life today in terms of what the refugees are going through now. So I do think it's important, and it empathises with their situation. It empathises in a way that people judge them, people are frightened, people are nervous, but also people are very accepting and very welcoming. So there are two sides to the coin. Not everybody has a sceptical view, and I think it's such a massive issue. And it's such a massive issue, and people have to recognise that it's so hard for them. We look at them from the outside as a group of people moving en masse, which is probably quite frightening for some people. You imagine being in their shoes. They've given up everything. Everything. So everything, you imagine giving up everything you have around you that is your home and your life, and everything that gives you safety and comfort, and you have to let that go. That's pretty scary, and we haven't really come that far.
There's similarities, but in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler, he had a program on to make Europe Jew-free, and his program consisted of killing all Jews. So it is different. I think there's much more prosperity in most of the country than there was then. And we're very, very fortunate. And some people help more than others. And you know, I like to help as much as I can, because you know how difficult it is to be in a strange country, not to have anything, not to be allowed to do this and not to allowed to do that, and to be moved around. But there's such huge numbers of people, not only from 2 or 3 countries, from most of the Middle East. You know, people are trying to get here and get in and get good jobs, but some just come just to have their lives, because they know that if they remained, they might be killed. So it's a similar situation, but it isn't the same.
I think in everyday life, I don't know of too many people that knew about it unless they've read about it. So I don't think it's something that's ever come up for discussion, and I think it came more to light with the refugee situation that's occurred from countries like Syria, where people have had to do exactly the same thing. But I think the Syrian refugee crisis is on a hugely bigger scale, because although there were hundreds of children that were rescued. This is almost like a whole population. It's a massive amount of people that have been moved en masse, and been found different homes and had to give up their home and their life and their way of life. So I think it's same but different, which says perhaps we haven't learnt that much really.
Refugee organisations all over the world are helping as much as they can, but it's not enough for them to do it alone. They need help. Put yourself in their shoes, running from war, terrorism, fear, persecution and death. They can't escape on their own. They need help. You could donate anything you can in order to aid these people in rebuilding their lives that was wrongly ripped away from them.
If you could sum up your experience and your life in 3 words, what would they be?
Please help others.